For almost 6 weeks, I thought my daughter was lying to me, and at 62 years old, I was ashamed of how much that hurt. Not because daughters never lie to mothers. Of course they do. They spare us details, edit their own pain, hide new relationships, old debts, medical results, bad decisions, all the things grown children think they can carry alone if they love us enough. But this felt different. My daughter, Rachel, was not simply keeping a confidence. She was moving around me in my own house as if she were trying to get somewhere before I did. She would answer the phone too fast. She would take mail from the table and say, "Just junk," without letting me see it first. Twice I walked into the kitchen and she'd go still in the middle of a text, locking the screen before I was close enough to catch even one word. If I asked whether something was wrong, she'd smile too quickly and say I was imagining a mood. Which, as it turns out, is an infuriating thing to say to a woman whose husband has spent years preferring that exact explanation for anything inconvenient. The sentence that broke the story open came on a Sunday night after dinner. Glenn had gone upstairs to shower, and Rachel was standing by the sink rinsing plates that didn't need rinsing because she was too agitated to stand still. I told her, more sharply than I intended, that whatever she was hiding had already done enough damage. She put the plate down, turned to me with tears standing in her eyes, and said, "Mom, I'm not hiding this from you. I'm keeping you safe from him." Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and slid it across the table. I didn't touch it right away. That is the part I remember most clearly. Not the crying, not the fear, not even my own pulse. Just the folder sitting on the kitchen table between us under the yellow pool of the pendant light, while my husband's footsteps moved across the floor above our heads. Rachel kept her hand on it a second too long, like she was having to make herself let go. I asked her what was inside. She said, "Everything I could get before he knew I was looking." I asked her who she meant by he, though of course I knew. She looked up toward the ceiling and said very quietly, "Dad." My husband, Glenn, was the kind of man people praised for being calm long after they should have realized calmness and goodness are not the same thing. He never yelled. He never slammed doors. He didn't drink too much, disappear for weekends, or say ugly things in front of company. He was attentive in the ordinary ways older husbands are often praised for. He remembered when the tires needed changing, noticed when the porch bulb went out, brought me tea without asking on cold mornings, and made exactly enough eye contact at church that people described him as steady. Steady is one of the most dangerous words in long marriages because women of my generation were taught to build whole lives around it. If a man was not flamboyant, not wasteful, not drunk, not overtly cruel, we were expected to treat the rest as temperament. Mood, privacy, just how he is. I married Glenn at 29 after one brief engagement in my early 20s that ended badly enough to leave me susceptible to men who seemed orderly. Glenn looked orderly from every angle. He worked in healthcare administration, understood forms, systems, billing, procedures, and had a way of making bureaucratic life sound manageable instead of humiliating. We had one daughter, one paid-off house, one retirement account that was never as full as I wanted but fuller than many people's, and the kind of marriage that from the outside looked almost boring. I used to think boring was safety. I know better now. Rachel was born when I was 33 and Glenn was 37. She was our only child because after a difficult pregnancy and one loss afterward, I decided I could survive many things but not another round of hope reorganized into grief. Glenn accepted that too quickly, which I thought was kindness at the time. Looking back, I think he liked small households because there were fewer witnesses and fewer loyalties to divide. Still, he was a good father in all the ways neighbors count. Packed lunches, dance recitals, tire changes when she got her first car. College visits. He was present. Present enough that when Rachel started acting strangely around him the year before all of this came apart, I didn't think fear. I thought resentment, old arguments, maybe some leftover anger from a strict adolescence, neither of them had fully reinterpreted as adulthood yet. She was 32 when she moved back into our guest room for a few months after her divorce. That was the official story, and most of it was true. Her marriage had ended in the slow, tired way modern marriages often do. Not with one catastrophe, but with 1,000 little failures of effort and honesty. She worked remotely for a hospital software company, so coming home temporarily while she got back on her feet made sense. I was glad to have her, if I'm honest. The house had grown too quiet in the years after my own retirement, and even though Glenn liked to say he enjoyed the peace of an empty nest, I found his version of peace too much like waiting rooms. Rachel coming back changed the air. More coffee cups, more shoes by the door, more life in the kitchen after 9. For the first month, everything felt almost healing. We cooked together. She helped me sort old closets. We watched terrible crime dramas and made fun of younger women on television making decisions no real woman with rent would ever make. Glenn was polite, distant, not especially warm but not unkind. Then the small things started. At first it was just the way Rachel watched him when he thought no one was watching. Not with hatred, with attention. Focused, exhausting attention like a person trying to memorize danger before it moved. Once, when Glenn asked if I wanted him to refill one of my prescriptions while he was out, I said yes, and Rachel answered before I could, "I'll do it." He smiled and said there was no need. She said, "I said I'll do it," in a voice so flat it made all three of us go still for a second. Later, she apologized and blamed work stress. I accepted that because mothers accept too much when the alternative is naming something ugly too early. Then came the calls. 3 times in 2 weeks, my phone rang from unknown numbers while I was in the garden or upstairs folding laundry, and each time Rachel got to it first. She would look at the screen, go pale in a way she tried to hide, and decline the call. Once I asked who it was. She said robocalls. Another time she said insurance spam. The third time she actually said, "Nobody you'd want to talk to." That answer sat in my body badly. Nobody I'd want to talk to according to whom? But before I could make it into a real conversation, Glenn came into the kitchen asking where the tape measure was, and the moment closed around itself the way dangerous moments often do inside families. Neatly, almost politely. The thing that should have stopped me sooner was the paperwork. I found Rachel one afternoon at the dining table surrounded by printouts she tried too fast to stack when she saw me. I laughed and asked if she was finally doing her taxes on time for once. She didn't laugh back. She said it was just work. The pages in her hands weren't work pages. I had spent 27 years in school administration. I know the look of payroll forms, HR authorizations, medical releases, account summaries, and legal notices. These were personal papers, older ones. Some photocopied, some printed from portals, some maybe photographed and reprinted from a phone. When I asked whose they were, she said, "Mom, please don't ask me that yet." Yet, that single word told me she was already living inside a clock I couldn't see. I wish I could say I trusted her enough to wait. I did not. That's part of the shame in this story. I had spent so many years being married to a man who made, not upsetting the structure, sound like maturity that when the structure finally started shaking, my first instinct was not to believe my daughter. It was to fear what she might be doing to the peace. Women my age were not raised to honor disruption until after it has already proven itself. We are raised to manage it, smooth it, lower the temperature, and ask for evidence in tones soft enough to keep the men in the room from withdrawing affection. 3 days before Rachel handed me the folder, I made a mistake. I told Glenn I thought she was hiding something from me. He did not react like a concerned father. He reacted like a man receiving confirmation. That is the only way I can describe it now. He lowered his voice, leaned on the kitchen counter, and said, "I was hoping you hadn't noticed yet." "Not what? Not noticed what?" He sighed and said, "She's been under a lot more strain than she admits. The divorce hit deeper than she's letting on, and I think she's become a little fixated on things that aren't helping her." There it was, calm, concerned, ready, as though he had already rehearsed how to explain her to me if necessary. I asked what things. He hesitated just long enough to look ethical. Then he said, "She's been going through some of our records, insurance forms, old account statements, medical documents. I think she's trying to make sense of why life turned out the way it did and grabbing at the wrong papers to do it." Grabbing at the wrong papers. It was such a Glenn phrase, not lying exactly, just arranging reality so that the emotionally dangerous person in the room was never him. He kept talking. Said Rachel had always had a tendency to catastrophize under emotional stress. Said maybe coming home had stirred up older resentments. Said he didn't want to embarrass her by confronting it too hard. Said he was trying to handle it gently. Handle it gently. That night I almost knocked on Rachel's door and demanded the truth. I didn't. Something stopped me, and to this day I'm grateful for whatever remained alive enough in my instincts to stop me from carrying his language into her room like a weapon. Instead, I waited, which is how I got the folder on Sunday. Inside were copies of my medical records, insurance forms, a long-term care inquiry, emails, beneficiary change requests, and one document I had never seen in my life, but recognized instantly as the kind of paperwork older women should fear more than burglars. A capacity assessment referral, requested by Glenn, not completed yet but prepared, timed, waiting. For one terrible second, I couldn't understand what I was seeing, not because the words were unclear, but because their meaning was too large to enter me at once. Glenn had contacted his friend Martin Keene, a physician with a private geriatric practice, and asked about documentation options for early cognitive decline in a spouse who was becoming erratic about finances, suspicious of family support, and increasingly resistant to necessary planning. That spouse was me. There was an email from an elder law office attaching draft documents for a revised durable power of attorney, updated healthcare proxy language, and a proposed transfer structure that would allow Glenn to manage volatility in the event of diminished capacity. Volatility. I had become weather in legal language. I looked up from the papers and asked Rachel the only question that mattered. "How long have you known?" She sat down very slowly. Then she told me everything. It had started 2 months earlier when she borrowed Glenn's printer while he was out. An email notification flashed in the corner of the screen from a law office she didn't recognize. The subject line included my name. She clicked before she had time to decide whether that made her a bad daughter. What she found was not one smoking gun, but enough to understand there was a private conversation happening about me without me. She said at first she thought maybe Glenn was trying to handle some insurance or estate issue and hadn't wanted to worry me. Then she found more. Notes, referrals, a request to speak with my primary doctor informally, a medication list with annotations in Glenn's handwriting next to the ones that caused drowsiness, a printed copy of an article about high-functioning women and the hidden onset of decline. Hidden onset of decline. I asked why she didn't tell me immediately. That was when she cried. Not loudly, not theatrically. In the exhausted way adult daughters cry when they are ashamed of the time they lost trying to choose the least damaging truth. She said she had tried to convince herself it was all preliminary, maybe overprotective, maybe fear-driven, maybe something she could stop quietly without shattering what was left of my trust in him. Then, a week later, she overheard Glenn on the phone saying, "If we wait until after the June review, I can get the physician note into the file before she knows what to object to." Object to. My life had become a sequence he was timing. That was when Rachel started intercepting calls. The unknown numbers were from Martin Keene's office, the elder law attorney, and once from the insurance coordinator Glenn was trying to route into a private care plan that would have shifted more control over our joint assets into his hands if capacity concerns were documented. She had been deleting voicemails because she was afraid that if I heard one too early, Glenn would simply pivot and tell me Rachel was destabilizing things on purpose. He had already started doing it. He had already told me she was fixating, spiraling, grabbing at the wrong papers. She knew him well enough to understand that if he got there first with the narrative, I might lose the truth before I ever saw it clearly. That is the part that still hurts. My daughter knew my husband's strategy better than I trusted her warning. There was more in the folder. A financial spreadsheet showing proposed liquidation of one of my retirement accounts to simplify household oversight. A note from the attorney saying if questions of competence became sensitive, It was best to frame everything as relief from stress rather than control. A draft letter, never sent, to my son in Arizona gently suggesting he should prepare for changes in your mother's judgment in the next year. Not changes in health, judgment. Glenn wasn't just planning authority over my accounts. He was building a version of me that could survive me if necessary. I sat there in my own kitchen with those papers and felt something old in me harden into final shape. Not panic, not even grief yet. Clarity. If Glenn had wanted another woman, I could have understood the category even while hating the man. If he had stolen money, there were words for that too. But this was something colder. He was preparing to inherit control over me while I was still standing at the sink making soup. He wanted to convert my ordinary aging into a legal atmosphere he could manage. He wanted me explained before I could object. I asked Rachel whether anyone else knew. She said only one person for sure, Martin Keene. Maybe the lawyer. Maybe my primary doctor's office had received a preliminary inquiry, but nothing formal yet. Then she said the sentence that changed revenge from emotion into plan. "Mom, he doesn't know I copied any of it. He thinks I'm just in the way." That was the only advantage we needed. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. Outwardly, the house stayed ordinary. Glenn made coffee. I folded towels. Rachel worked from the guest room. We nodded through breakfast. He kissed my temple before church. We hosted my sister for lunch one Sunday. If there is a particular skill women over 50 have in abundance, it is the ability to keep a house running while a private war is being built in silence between the hallway and the pantry. But under that normalcy, everything changed. Rachel and I moved fast. We changed passwords Glenn didn't know I even had access to. We pulled my pharmacy records, retirement documents, account authorizations, and property deeds. We moved a small but crucial amount of money into an individual account he could not touch without triggering questions. We met with Patricia Grayson, an attorney recommended by one of Rachel's friends, who was old enough not to call this a misunderstanding and young enough to know exactly which emergency injunctions mattered. Patricia read the folder once and said, "He's not planning for your decline. He's planning to document it before it exists." That was the cleanest sentence anyone had said to me in days. She told us not to confront him early. Men like Glenn did not panic well, but they recovered quickly if given room to reframe. We needed sequence. We needed documentation. We needed him to keep believing I was still where he had placed me, slightly slower, slightly trusting, slightly behind. So I gave him exactly that woman for just a little longer. I let him walk me through a long-term care brochure one Tuesday evening while nodding in all the right places. I let him tell me the house felt, too much to manage alone later, and say maybe simplifying things now would be kinder to everyone. I asked 1 or 2 soft questions, then let him answer them with that low, competent tone he used when he thought he was soothing me into surrender. He seemed almost tender those nights, which made me understand that control and affection are often roommates in men like him. He wasn't enjoying the idea of hurting me. He was enjoying the idea of arranging me. The break in his rhythm came from impatience. Martin Keene's office called the house directly again 4 days later, while Glenn was home early. I was in the laundry room. Rachel was upstairs. Glenn answered on the second ring, and because he believed he was still speaking inside his own system, said, "No, she doesn't need to know the wording yet. Just keep the appointment held until the 16th. I stood in the doorway before he turned around. He saw my face, then the phone, and for a split second I watched his entire internal map recalculate. Most people would have asked who was on the phone. I didn't. I just said, "Held for what?" He smiled. That is what I want people to remember. He smiled. Then he said, "Honey, you're upset already, and this is exactly why I wanted to discuss it gently." There it was. Not truth, not apology. Management. I looked at him and realized that if I let him start speaking, he would still try to walk me into the version of events where my emotional response was the first problem, not his hidden plan. And maybe 3 months earlier he could have done it. Maybe 6 years earlier. But not after the folder, not after Rachel, not after hearing a physician's office discussed like a staging area. So I didn't let him continue. I said, Good. Then let's discuss it gently in front of everyone. He stopped smiling. I called Patricia from the kitchen phone while he watched me. Not because I needed the call, because I needed him to hear my side become procedural. Then I called my son on speaker and said, "Whatever your father tells you in the next few days, you need to come home and hear this in person." Then I called my sister. Then Martin Keene's office and asked them to confirm in writing who had requested what. Each call took less than 2 minutes. Each call moved the room farther away from his control. The family meeting happened on Friday in our living room. Not because I wanted drama, because I wanted witnesses and no retreat into private tone. My son flew in Thursday night. My sister came after lunch. Patricia sat at the far end of the sofa with a legal pad on her knee. Rachel had the folder, now tripled in size with fresh records and email confirmations. Glenn stood by the mantel in his good sweater, looking like every respectable older husband who ever hoped posture could substitute for innocence. I let Rachel speak first. That mattered. I wanted everyone in the room to understand that the daughter he would soon call unstable, meddling, divorced, dramatic, too emotional, whatever was easiest, had been the one protecting her mother while the man of the house was planning a medical and legal ambush. She walked them through the calls, the copied emails, the attorney drafts, the power of attorney changes, the retirement account strategy, the referral notes. She did not cry until the very end, when she read the line from Glenn's email about getting the physician note into the file before I knew what to object to. My son sat with his elbows on his knees and stared at the carpet like someone trying not to commit a felony in front of his own children's grandmother. My sister went gray. Patricia only looked at Glenn. Then I gave him his chance. I said, "You may explain it." He tried. Of course he tried. He said he was worried about me. He said I had become more forgetful. He said he feared what would happen if I suddenly had a health event and nothing was in order. He said he was trying to protect the family from chaos. He said Rachel had invaded private correspondence and built the ugliest possible reading of responsible planning. Then he said the sentence that destroyed him. I was waiting for the right time because I knew how she'd react. Patricia looked up and said, "So you agree she had not consented?" That was the sound of the trap closing. He tried to correct it. Too late. My son asked why a competent, informed wife needed to be surprised by physician notes and legal restructuring if this was all for her benefit. My sister asked why my daughter had to intercept calls if nothing was being hidden. Rachel asked why he told me she was spiraling before I had seen a single page. Glenn answered all of them the same way men like him always do, by trying to make concern itself proof of his good intentions. But concern is not clean once the paperwork exists. The payoff, though, came from one thing he did not know. Patricia had already filed an emergency revocation and notice package that afternoon. Meaning that by the time Glenn finished explaining why he only wanted to help, every institution he planned to use had already received formal notice from me. Any claim of diminished capacity was disputed. Any power transfer was unauthorized. Any medical representation made without my express consent was contested, and any future communication regarding my competency would be treated as adversarial and documented. He was not just exposed in the room. He was late. That was what finally changed his face. Not anger, not grief, not hurt pride. Fear. Because for the first time since I had known him, he understood that he had not been interrupted in the middle of a plan. He had reached the end of it and found that someone else had already arrived there first. I asked him one last question in front of all of them. If Rachel had not seen that email, when exactly were you going to tell me I was becoming legally inconvenient? He did not answer. My son stood up and said, "You don't get to speak for her anymore." My daughter started crying then, not out of weakness but release. My sister said very quietly, "You were going to bury her in paperwork while she was still alive." And Glenn, steady, reasonable, careful Glenn, had nothing left except a room full of people no longer hearing him as the calmest voice in it. He was out of the house by Monday. The divorce itself was not quick, but it was clean in the only way that matters. He lost the authority he had been building toward. The physician note was never written. The legal transfer never occurred. The retirement shift was blocked. The care plan was voided before it existed. My son stopped listening to his father's versions of things. My daughter stopped apologizing for the vigilance that saved me. And Glenn, who had spent 32 years treating my trust as if it were simply the natural background of his life, had to face the exquisite humiliation of being described in court records, financial correspondence, and attorney letters exactly as he had tried to describe me: unstable, strategic, and unsafe to leave in quiet control. That last part still gives me a satisfaction too old to blush over, because the revenge was never just leaving him. It was making sure the machinery he built to explain me ended up explaining him instead. The weeks after he left were quieter than I expected and harder in the body than in the heart. I was not mourning a love by then. I was recovering the right to stand in my own life without being pre-translated by someone else. Women our age are too often praised for endurance when what we really need is uninterrupted authorship. My house got larger after he left, not smaller. My thoughts got simpler. Even my sleep changed. I did not realize how much of the marriage had become anticipatory until I stopped anticipating his explanations before I had even formed my questions. As for Rachel, the guilt she carried took longer to untie than the legal knots did. She kept saying she should have told me sooner, should have trusted me faster, should have moved earlier. I told her the truth. She was raised in the same house I was. She had learned, just like I had, that Glenn's version of concern often arrived first and sounded responsible enough to make resistance feel rude. The miracle was not that she hesitated. The miracle was that she eventually chose me over the atmosphere he had spent decades creating. That is what made the ending worth it. Not just that I won, that she did too. Because what Glenn counted on most was not my trust. It was inheritance of trust. He believed the daughter in that house would eventually learn to read me the way he did, as someone to be managed gently, not heard clearly. Instead, she became the one person in the family who refused to let him turn me into paperwork before I knew I was under revision. If you want another story about what happens when money, marriage, and betrayal collide in the ugliest possible way, I've left one for you on screen. It's about a woman whose retirement savings were stolen, and how it took her 5 years to get every penny back. Click that one next.